Hello and welcome to The Current Thing with me, Nick Dixon. We are back and we have one of our most requested guests. It is Mr. Academic Agent coming back to the show. How you doing?
How you doing, Nick? Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, no worries. We are back. We come back to you at the turn of the tide because Trump has won, and of course Nima, full title Dr. Nima Parvini. Are you Nima now? Are you Academic Agent, or does it matter?
Well, it's like Bruce Wayne and Batman, Nick. The real me, the real person is Batman, right? And Bruce Wayne is the mask. The real me is academic
Right.
agent, but Dr. Nima Parvini is the mask I have to wear in public, unfortunately.
Okay.
so,
Well, I'm
yeah.
not sure which one we're getting today. But we wanted to get you back on. Well, there's so much to talk about. The first time we talked about your book, The Populist Delusion, people loved that
Mhm.
episode. And I said, we've got to get you back on and do The Prophets of Doom, which was the follow up book. But we're going to do that next time because we've got this pressing topical issue, which of course is Trump winning and
Mhm.
your predictions. And you were sort of known for saying for a long time Trump will win. I mean, I said it as well. I think we said it maybe for different reasons, and you got it all right. And can you just give us a brief summary of that for people who may not know?
Well, I mean, the call was a little bit uh, more than simply Trump will win, right? Um, it was saying that I thought that elements of the regime, let's just say, or elements of the powers that be, had made peace with the idea of Trump as president. And, you know, Kamala Harris is was basically put there as a candidate to, in pro wrestling parlance, do the job, which means to lose, right? And I had this idea. I mean, as soon as Harris replaced Biden, and it was going to be Harris as the candidate, I was like, this is the worst. I mean, I instantly knew Kamala Harris would be one of the worst candidates of all time, just based on her characteristics, right? Because I have not just been born out of an egg. I've seen Kamala Harris. We knew she only had 3% last time. We know that she can't talk. Um, and then So when Harris was the candidate, and then the various kind of up and comers in the Democrat Party started ducking her campaign, like Gavin Newsom was like, "No, I don't want any part of this," or Josh Shapiro, who is the governor of Pennsylvania, the obvious choice to be her VP because she needed Pennsylvania to have any chance of winning the election. But he's like, "No, I don't want this. I'm not going to do it." Instead, Kamala Harris is going to pick this kind of chubby fat dude that nobody's heard of called what's it? What's it? I've even forgotten his name already. Waltz, right?
Tim Waltz.
Tim Waltz.
Knucklehead.
Who usually when you pick a vice presidential uh, candidate, you're meant to kind of compensate for what you're not good at. So Kamala Harris, with the best will in the world, was not a centrist in the Democrat Party. She was seen as being on the left of the party, right? So she needed to pick a centrist to do the thing that Joe Biden used to do. I can't remember what they call it now, like a blue dog or a red dog or something. But it's basically the equivalent of our Blairite, say, a Labour guy who's kind of running as a Tory, right? The Democrats have always had candidates like this who can appeal to Republican voters. And Josh Shapiro, basically, kind of one of those. Otherwise, he wouldn't be winning states like Pennsylvania, right? So, well, he may have other tricks up his sleeve to win Pennsylvania, but she kind of needed him for that. The other reason she needed Josh Shapiro is because for a certain part of the voting base and an important part of the Democrat voting base, um, uh, well, there's just a situation in the Middle East, let's just say, and that was proving problematic with the Democrat base, if you recall. And this was actually the reason given for her not choosing Josh Shapiro, because when she didn't choose Josh Shapiro, a lot of people pointed out, and a lot of Republicans pointed out, oh, she didn't pick him because of anti-Semitism. That was the reason, right? Or within the Democratic base, i.e., she picked someone even further to her left, due to that issue, right? Um, so to me, when those sorts of things were happening, I pretty much saw the writing on the wall. And in electoral, I mean, as you know, if you've read Populist Illusion, I don't really believe in democracy, Nick. Um, the way I make predictions and the way I look at things is to analyze the fundamentals, the ABCs of power, and who are the organized minorities behind the scenes, um, maneuvering things to get the win. So in this case, in this election, there were two different coalitions of power brokers behind each of the candidates. Um, Kamala Harris had basically some elements of the Democratic Party, but not all of them, pivotally, as the Newsom and the Shapiro example show. She also didn't really have the support of Joe Biden, which has become very obvious. He put the MAGA hat on. He kept on doing these gaffes. You know, so I got the impression that the Democrat Party was kind of lukewarm about this in general. Um, and then over on Trump's side, the difference between this election and 2020 was that, I mean, everybody knows about Elon Musk, of course, and Peter Thiel and these sorts of characters, what we might call the based billionaires or the tech bros. What's his name, Andre's son, and there's a few others. But also, very noticeably, I think he had the support of uh, broadly what you might call hardcore Zionists. To give an example, Ben Shapiro, right? Ben Shapiro, if you have a look at who he supported, he actually supported Ron DeSantis over Trump, right? He didn't like he was a never Trumper back in 2016, much like JD Vance was, incidentally. But so he had it's very noticeable that when you have people like Ben Shapiro on side, it also comes with a whole string of other people who are on side as well, like behind the scenes. And I mean, people can look at the list of big donors behind Trump. Um, so I really think that in this election, 10-7 and the events that happened in the Middle East there are of extraordinary significance. Okay, and an example I would give: there's a comedian, a New York comedian called Michael Rappaport. I don't know if you're aware of this fellow, Michael
Yeah, he's an
Rappaport.
actor, isn't he?
He's an actor. I think he does like comedy gigs sometimes at clubs in New York, and yeah, he's an actor. But he was famous for being a very vehement, very outspoken never Trumper. He hated Trump. He had like peak Trump derangement syndrome. But after 10-7 happened, I remember he recorded and uploaded a number of extraordinary rants to his followers, basically saying like, "We're going to remember blah 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 blah." And within the space of about a month, he became MAGA. He started supporting Trump. I was like, "Wow, this is interest. This is an interesting shift. This wasn't happening before." Kind of Jewish New York comedian. This is not your average Trump voter, right? Or hasn't been historically your average Trump voter. So there was a discernible shift, at least online. I don't know if it's been reflected in the actual votes, but online there was a very vocal shift towards Trump from people like that. So when I started to see that, I was thinking, well, who's actually still behind Kamala Harris, right? Because we had other people like Mark Zuckerberg. We know that 4 years ago he made $200 to $300 million available to help make it the freest, safest, fairest election we've ever seen in 2020, if you remember. I mean, Zuckerberg told us he had made this money available. This time round, he's like, oh, actually, Trump's all right, and I'm going to stay neutral. I've gone off politics, by the way, guys. Or you had, I mean, later on, you had
Yeah,
Jeff Bezos
and
as
he even said
another
Trump was.
example.
He even said it was
Go on.
badass, didn't he? He goes, it was pretty badass when he came back and said fight, fight, fight. So it was a sort of tacit endorsement almost.
Yeah, so I mean, all I'm saying is that there were very powerful people suddenly saying, "Oh, we're kind of cool with Trump now." Um, and then there were more subtle things. which I mean, I made lots of videos on this that people can go and watch. But I have this idea that the mainstream media, um, top line mainstream media now, what I call the tier one publications. So I'm not talking about the kind of dipshit intern working at the Independent, say, or like Guardian opinion pieces, or even New York Times opinion pieces. I'm talking about the kind of front page headline news, BBC, CNN, Associated Press, um, Reuters, Bloomberg. I'm trying to think of some other ones now. Financial Times, New York Times. What the kind of here the Times. I mean, if you ever want to see what the regime is thinking, the Times. I always think our Times here, the London Times, is kind of you can kind of see where they are, right? And I have this way of just you can kind of pass a headline to see where they're going, okay? Because I have a theory, Nick, that the regime always telegraphs what's going to happen. They always tell you what's going to happen before it happens, and they never play 4D chess, contrary to their reputation. When they say something's going to happen, you don't get swerves, right? So, for example, when they were all in on Ukraine back 2 years ago, there were no like voices saying, "Oh, hold on a minute," or they were all in lockstep and they were all going towards, "Oh, this is going to happen." Now, sometimes what they want to happen is just wishful thinking. Okay, so like for example, the walls are closing in for Donald Trump. How many times do we see that narrative? That was them just trying to make that event happen, and because they're not all powerful, it doesn't always work. Okay, but on certain things, like for example, who's going to be the president, they really do telegraph far in advance. Okay, so in 2020, I remember sitting and watching a week before the election, the BBC telling us, "Listen, what's going to happen is a ton of votes are going to come in for Trump. Trump is going to declare victory. Then late in the night, a load of votes are going to come in for Biden, and we're going to have a problem, right? Because Trump's going to claim fraud." And the BBC primed their audience, the British audience, for that. CNN did the same. I mean, all of the stations, all of the top line tier one media did the same thing. They primed the audience for what was going to happen. This time around, there was none of that. This time, it was all things like, "Oh, what's a second Trump presidency going to look like? What does it mean for your money?" Things like that. You had publications like The Atlantic saying, I mean, I remember they ran one story saying the resistance is pretty much over. Everybody's given up, basically. The difference between now and 2020 is the resistance is just, they're resigned to it. They've given up, right? So you can always tell what kind of the mood music is of the media. And where, I mean, where I think somebody like me is different from many other people in this space, Nick, to be frank, is that a lot of people in our spaces pay attention to what I call slop, noise. They pay attention to a lot of noise, right? That is unimportant stories that are amplified for clicks for social media. Oh, libs of TikTok, say on Twitter, is always sharing stuff that's not really that important. Okay. Or it will be like some crazy left wing opinion piece at the back of the New York Times or in the Guardian or whatever. So that they often miss the signal because they're focused on all of the noise. Okay. And then within that, there is also the noise of Tory versus Labour or Democrat versus Republican. Okay, so under this kind of top line way of looking at power, you do actually have operatives trying to actually campaign. Like Kamala Harris, even though I think there was an expectation of many people that she would be there to lose, she still had a campaign and she still had $1 billion to spend, right? And they're going to have to spend that money on something and do something. So you're going to get stories that come out that are just part of that campaign, right? Or polls that they commissioned, for example, that showed her being closer to where she would be, or in the most egregious case in Iowa, 10 points up, which is, in my view, should be considered criminal. If a poll is that far out, something's gone very, very wrong. But yeah, so you understand what I'm saying, though. There's a general mood music, and since 10-7 happened, the mood music, I think, has been towards the expectation that Trump is going to be the president again, towards the expectation that America is going to drop Ukraine. How do we know this? I mean, literally, they tell us. Literally, the media just says, oh, the EU are making preparations for a Trump presidency. Oh, we need to try to make the Ukraine war Trump proof because he's going to come in again, you know? So, and they have to do that because when you have so many different people, not just the top line elites, but all of the little non-governing elites underneath, that they have to kind of know what the score is just for there to be a certain degree of predictability and stability in the system for the money men, for the markets, and so on. So they always do this telegraphing. Um, and really, I guess the core of my prediction was just picking up on the subtle hints that they drop. I mean, one of the little tricks, for example, is the headline phrased as a closed question, right? Is the question, can Kamala Harris beat Donald Trump, or can Donald Trump beat Kamala Harris? And if it's a closed question, and again, it has to be, can't be like some BuzzFeed thing written by a 20-year-old. It has to be the big old fashioned media, right? Fleet Street, or in America, the big papers there. Um, if it's a question like that, the answer is always no. Always no. The closed question, the answer is always no. So if the question is, can Kamala Harris beat Donald Trump? They're telling you implicitly, no is the answer. And one of the things I picked up on is that when it was a Kamala headline, it was always stuff like that. When it was a Donald Trump headline, it was always what a Trump presidency will mean for you, or here's how you can prepare type thing, or here are the sorts of people he's going to pick in his administration. So, I mean, once you, and see, the trouble is with this, Nick, when you're saying these things back in February or June, people think you're mad. When you say it after the fact, now people think it's obvious, right? Because it's happened. Um, but the reason that my particular prediction picked up a lot of, I guess, notice online is because many people who are Trump fans, or many people in the MAGA camp, let's just say, or many people on our side, I think they've got trained on demoralization or being blackpilled, as people say. Um, and so the pushback I got was, yeah, but they're just going to cheat again. They're just going to go for the steal again. That was because that's the narrative in MAGA, right? That they stole the 2020 election. That is what they believe. That's what Donald Trump believes. Um, and I'm saying, well, like, listen, you're never going to. The worst time to rob a bank is directly after you've robbed a bank. Why? Because they're going to beef up security, and that did actually happen. There was uh, state level Supreme Court decisions that prevented late votes coming in. Um, you know, like it's crazy that this was the rules, but in some of the states, you could send in your ballot late, and they'd still count it because it didn't have to have a date stamp on it. Well, they basically tightened up all those rules so that couldn't happen. I mean, it is really mind blowing that wasn't the rule already. But so they basically changed the rules in some places to make it much more difficult to get this situation that happened last time, where it was 4 a.m. and all of a sudden, what's this massive tranche of new ballots that we found? Um, Although I will say, I did election night at Lotus Eaters, and there was a video going around of a truckload of new ballots arriving in Pennsylvania. And I remember in the backstage there, people were sending this round, and there was this feeling like, oh, here we go again. They're gonna start, because at that time in the night, Trump still needed Pennsylvania. And literally within 10 minutes, they called Pennsylvania. They called it for Trump, which shocked me because I was like, when I saw that, I was like, okay, we may be getting some repeat of it. What all of that told me, or my read of that whole situation, Nick, is that let's just say the machinery that was made available to Joe Biden was not made available to Kamala Harris for whatever reason. There may have been attempts on the ground to repeat some of the usual shenanigans that the Democrats always do, their ground tactics, you might call it. But this time, they did not have the support of the entire apparatus of the regime. Hence, on the night, New York Times called it quickly for Trump. They predicted Trump was going to win on the evening. I remember those predictions coming in. Or I'll give you another example in Arizona, which is still counting now for Carrie Lake, because I've been watching that with interest. As we record this, it's still not decided what's going to happen in Arizona. But with 70% in, most of the press just said, yeah, Trump's going to win this. We're going to call it for Trump. In 2020, that sort of stuff wasn't happening, if you remember. There were some places where it was really obvious that Trump was going to win by that point, but they just weren't calling it. Or, in the case of Fox, for example, they call Arizona the other way when the margin was much closer. So things were very, very different this time around. And what was the difference? Uh, well, like I said, more elements of power were okay with Trump winning this time. And my view is that they just did not accept it last time. You know, and this is
All right.
this is basically my view of democracy, is that the elites basically between them decide, are we going to accept the will of the people, yes or no? And for various different reasons which we can get into, I think this time around they've gone like, right, we're going to have to work with this because the alternative is going to be a disaster for us.
All right. Very interesting. I've got lots I agree with, of course, and a couple of maybe quibbles. So, I mean, I was able to see a lot of the same stuff without even. Well, I have read a lot of Elite Theory because I've read your books and other books, but just through experience, I mean, the signal and the noise, very clear. I mean, for example, I'll give you one. October 7th, 2016. This is the real October 7th, Billy Bush weekend.
Mm-hmm.
There's this famous moment. Trump comes out, recording from 2005. He's saying you can grab women by the bleep. We all know the video. That comes out a month before the election because it was my birthday, November 8th, 2016, as it is when we record, weirdly. Um, so Trump comes out with this video. I don't recall knowing at the time whether that was over or not. I think I was worried about it, but I didn't think it was like over. Many people thought it was over. Steve Bannon has this story where he says, no, 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 sir, you still have 100% metaphysical certitude of winning. 100%. And Trump's like, 100%, that's stupid. 100% metaphysical certitude. Because he must have been like, what are you on about, Bannon? But he knew this doesn't matter. And he said, look, that's the noise, not the signal. So I've been trained on that. So when I see things like, for example, the Puerto Rico joke from Tony Hinchcliffe, everyone's going, that's it for Trump. He just called Puerto Rico garbage. It's over. I went, nothing. I even tweeted, this doesn't matter at all. Look at the Bannon example. This is noise. This is far more at stake than a joke, and people can take jokes anyway. And then it got undermined anyway by Biden calling everyone garbage, and like you say, one of these gaffes that seemed like for Trump. But there were so many examples. There was this thing where
And
Trump
Peanut, by
said
the way,
something
and
rude.
Peanut destroyed that as well. That bloody
Peanut,
squirrel, the squirrel
yes,
that became an icon.
the squirrel.
I tell you what, in 10 years' time, that's going to be a quiz. That's going to be a quiz question. Who was Peanut, and why was he important to the 2024 election? Anyway, go on.
Yeah, well, Peanut was symbolic of how everything just went perfect for Trump. I mean, the assassination, survival, fight, 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 Biden undermining the garbage thing, Peanut, the Democrats deciding to murder a squirrel last minute. Yeah, it just all went perfect. But there was an example where Trump insulted a room of black people by saying Kamala became black, and then when people were writing, it's over for him. I was like, that's nonsense, definitely not over. But even Vance, oh, Vance is the wrong pick. Vance is too weird. I was like, Vance is a great pick. Vance won't be able to handle Kamala. Yes, he will. I was just completely never wavering. Oh, Harris's brat. What? Fuck off. It was just like, there was constant attempts to sort of make you worry.
Yes.
And as you say, the black-pilled people, they're so black-pilled. I mean, I think it's a slight failure of character, to be honest. I think Xennials like you and me have a slightly different character level, where the Zoomer is a little bit more flighty. When they put in Harris, well, it was like, oh, Harris is going to win. It's over. It's like, no, it's not. She's rubbish. What are you talking about? It was incredible. And the other one I just want to reference is DeSantis, because someone said to me yesterday it meant nothing that I didn't waver on Trump. Well, it didn't mean nothing, because I had my podcast with Toby Young, and we argued for half an hour. He was totally pro DeSantis, as you say Ben Shapiro was, as was Elon Musk. They all went DeSantis. I never wavered from Trump for similar reasons to Carl, actually, Carl Benjamin, who said that, Trump, the story is behind Trump, the mythos was behind Trump. But if you know Trump, the way I did it was just my inherent faith in Trump, which is kind of cult like, but also looking at people like Roger Stone who know what he's talking about. And he said, look, I've been on Nixon's campaign, I've been on multiple campaigns. DeSantis is too introverted. Yes, Nixon was an introvert, but DeSantis is awkward. He's up against Trump, who's just a completely different level of fame and charisma, just completely different thing. And I was able to see, yeah, DeSantis, this is nothing. The kind of classical lib likes him, and he might do okay in the future, but he can't compete with Trump. So I never wavered. Milo said the same on that. So there are things like that you could do, that you don't have to be a genius to just look at it and go, not I'm saying you're not a genius, but you didn't have to be on some of these to say that Harris was awful. By the way, I always said pop up when we grew up. You say jobber, don't you? Which is the technical term from wrestling, in case anyone doesn't know, of these people that are just there. When we grew up, we
To
called them
lose, yeah,
pop ups. You could always tell the difference. You'd have like the Mountie, and he's got a song, and he's got a cattle prod. I am the
yeah,
Mountie. I mean, that was his later song, but
mm,
he's got a song. He's got a manager, and it's like, who's going to win? Is it the Mountie or Mike Stevens? Mike
yeah.
Stevens, big moment for him. He's just in some blue trunks, nothing else.
One of the things I always loved about them is the way the announcer, the ring announcer, would make them sound so shit. It'd be like, "Oh, here he comes! It's whoever, Big Boss Man, and his opponent, Chad Norris," and it'd be like, no,
Yeah.
crowd
Notice one of
deathly
them's
silent.
not a policeman. Yeah, yeah. Notice one of them's just wearing normal trunks. He's not a policeman. He doesn't have a big stick. He doesn't have a manager. He doesn't have a theme tune. And it's just like, oh, he gets in one clothesline at the start before getting brutally beaten for the next 2 minutes.
No,
Yeah.
to be fair to Kamala Harris, calling her a jobber at that level is probably a bit unfair, because she is the vice president, even as we're talking. But it's more like, like in wrestling, where you'd get somebody who's on like the downswing of their career, or they'd had a big push, but now they're obviously there to make other people look good. Like it'd be like Tito Santana, but in like 1992. Not Tito Santana when he was El Matador, right? Or if you
Yeah.
remember in
Because
that
characters
same
come back
era,
like Razor Ramon. Razor
yeah,
Ramon was big, but then he came back as part of the three with New World Order with Hulk Hogan. I can't remember
mhm.
who the other one was. So then they're a bit lesser at that point.
Yeah, but like do you remember? There was like Virgil, the bodyguard of Ted DiBiase, and then he turned on
Yeah.
DiBiase, right? And he had a bit of a push there in the feud with DiBiase, right? But then that was over,
Right.
and Virgil had nothing,
Right.
right? He was just like,
Right.
"It's Virgil, hey," and it'd be
Yeah.
like, "All right, it's Virgil versus Yokozuna," and Yokozuna would just destroy him. And basically,
Yeah.
Kamala
Shit on
Harris
his
is
face.
more like she's got some name recognition, but she obviously wasn't a top tier name and not a main event star that to put in there with Trump, who is basically the biggest superstar in the entire. I remember one of the easiest calls during the election, Nick, was when again us versus the Zoomer crew, right? I remember as soon as the Taylor Swift thing happened, I put out a tweet and I said, listen, Donald Trump is the most famous person in the world. The actions of Taylor Swift are meaningless. She is like an ant looking at a god. Now, if you go back to that tweet and look at the replies underneath that tweet, there are people saying, oh, you don't understand, AA. How much young girls love Taylor Swift. You don't understand, AA. Today or yesterday, The Guardian put out a piece saying, did the celebrity endorsements actually hurt Kamala Harris? And one of the stats in there was that 20% of the people would actually turned off, like said they were less likely to vote for Harris after the Taylor Swift endorsement than for it, and only 8% of people said it the other way. Now, again, like to me, these are just obvious things, but in this day and age, saying obvious things, I mean, I don't know, like when you've got, like to me, it's just really obvious that people like Beyonce and Taylor Swift are not going to shift anybody's mind on an election involving Donald Trump. I mean, you know, like who is going to
Yeah.
be like, oh yeah, I was thinking of voting for Donald Trump, but now Beyonce has come in. I'm going to go for Kamala Harris. There's basically nobody. So anyway, go on.
Yeah. Well, one point about that people have made is it's new media as well. So you have a parasocial relationship with Joe Rogan that you simply don't have with Beyonce because she's part of kind of the old star system. They don't use that term in music; that's for movies, but
Mm.
it's the same thing. So that is another key difference. We could talk about that in a minute. The shift to new media, which is quite interesting, and the true death of old media. But there's a couple of things I wanted to add. Um, just a small thing on Kamala, just because one of my pet theories. It's also I think it's also hard to do. It sounds obvious, the unprecedented. So when we talk about Rachel Reeves being female chancellor, no one really cares because it's not really a landmark, and Starmer can just appoint it anyway. It's significant for her. It's significant because women are less likely to be into economics. So it's not a bad achievement, obviously, but I don't think it's significant. But I think Kamala Harris trying to be first female president, it hasn't been done. There's obviously a reason it hasn't been done, and then you take a candidate who's notoriously weak, who didn't get any votes in the primaries, you put her back in last minute, and you say she's going to do this unprecedented thing. To me, there wasn't enough emphasis on that. Anyway, even aside from your sort of the regime wants Trump, even just if aside from that, even if that wasn't true, you could just look at it and go, "Hang on, how is this person going to do that?" It's like when you another analogy, you face an undefeated boxer like Usyk. You're like, you've got to do. I've never seen this guy knocked down except for one low blow. I've never seen him like that. It's like, you're going to beat this guy. I've never seen him beaten. So it's like, it's always very hard to do that. So I think that was
Mm.
also very unrealistic that she was ever going to win. And
Yeah,
another thing I noticed from the mood music is that all the people were meeting. Sorry, everyone was meeting Trump, like Starmer, and they either
yeah,
weren't
that's
meeting
right.
Harris or they were meeting her in a much more sort of perfunctory way.
Yeah, no, absolutely true. Um, Also, one of the things that I think has not been given enough attention is that I mean, whatever you make of the 2020 election, there was a shift in white voters and especially white male voters. From there was about a 3 to 4% swing from Trump to Biden. Okay, and one of the things I did, I didn't have the guts to upload this video, Nick, because back then, when if you talked about this, you'd be in trouble on YouTube and things like that. But also, I mean, I'll freely admit, I didn't upload this video because the narrative it told was not exactly the one that MAGA tells either, right? Because one of the things that people were doing, they were just looking at the swing states, kind of ignoring the rest of the map. So what I did is I put all the votes in a massive spreadsheet across every single state, okay, and tabulated how did those safe ones, the red seats, the blue seats, etc., as well as the swing states, how were they looking for Biden? Okay, um, including in places which are not known for their malarkey and so on. And I noticed that even in those places, there was about a plus 3, +4 to Biden. Okay, now a lot of people are not going to want to admit this, but I kind of have this idea that whether would they admit it or not, there is a difference between stated and revealed preference, right? So the stated preference of all people will be race is not a factor for me, sex is not a factor for me, but there's something I like to call the lizard brain, right? The lizard brain, which is something more primal and something beyond your rational mind or your post hoc justifications for why you're doing whatever. And I had this idea that this time around, many of those people who would have been attracted by Joe Biden, the old, don't forget, he's an old kind of, in America, there are some people who saw him as being quite kind of paternalistic and safe. And it's like your old granddad coming around, he could have a beer with you. And, I mean, we're used to seeing Joe Biden as an evil criminal, right? I'm just saying that some people in America, like Joe Biden could go into like a union workman's club or something, and kind of have some camaraderie with the people there because he had that kind of, he's from that generation, and he also sometimes says the wrong thing, right? Like, I mean, sometimes he says things that are not politically correct and things like that. So all of these little things kind of are, you could say, endearing traits of Biden, or they were before he lost his marbles. And I immediately thought, well, so many of those people, everybody was talking about suburban women. Do you remember all of this? I was like, when they get into that
Mm.
voting booth, so many of those suburban women are going to be like, am I really going to vote for Kamala Harris? Um, the lizard brain kicking in. I mean, I'll tell you, Nick, I have a similar theory about what may happen to the Tory party in an upcoming election, given their recent choices. But that's a story for another day. So I really do believe
Yeah.
that.
Well, that was, yeah, that's, and that is a factor, absolutely. And yes, white women didn't shift; they actually voted for Trump. The main demographics that voted, you've probably seen this, against Trump were black women, Jewish women, and LGBTQ plus people. So they're the main. I mean, black women still 91% against, and still most black men against, but many Latino men came over, and as you say, white women came over.
Yeah, but I mean, look,
I've just got a couple of. Go on.
sorry, LGBT and Jewish women. We're talking like at most 4% of the population. I mean, these
Well,
aren't
that's probably why
great.
she lost.
uh, anyway,
Yeah,
go on.
yeah. She's like, well, I've got the Jewish women. Yeah, yeah. Kamala, you've gone for the role. We've got every white man. Yeah, yeah. I know. I've got a couple of minor pushbacks. I'm not, because I'm too agreeable as an interviewer, but I do have to have a couple of minor pushbacks based on your opening kind of a statement. Statement's
Mhm.
too strong. It's a podcast, but one is that one's quite trivial. One's maybe more interesting. One is that you mentioned the money was behind Trump, but actually, Alex Jones and people point out only 10% of Trump's funding came from these big billionaires. Yes, he had the kind of Silicon Valley, which sort of moved to Trump, which was very significant. Elon Musk, Andreessen, and all these people, as you said, that was very significant. But it was still only a small amount, and Trump still raised far less than Harris. So, question one is: was the money actually with Trump or not? And number two, which occurred to me when you were talking, is that in 2016 they didn't telegraph for Trump. They telegraphed aggressively against Trump. So I wanted to check what your take on that
Mhm.
is, because, yes, as you say, on the night this time, the New York Times was going, yep, 67% Trump, 85% Trump. And I was like, this is amazing. The New York Times is just giving it to Trump. But in 2016, they gave it 99% to Hillary, famously.
Yeah. So, like I said earlier on, just like when the regime signals that Vladimir Putin is about to be overthrown, or the walls are closing in for Trump, right? Sometimes it's just wishful thinking on their part. They telegraph something that they would like to happen that doesn't happen. Okay. And I think 2016 and Brexit were both ones where they were really telegraphing the other way and were caught on the hop. Um, and by God, didn't we know it? I mean, didn't we all know it? Because they, like I said, they're never subtle. They spent literally the next 8 years calling the guy Hitler and doing everything they
Mm,
could to try to destroy him, right? And so this is why the about turn in the past year or so is so extraordinary in a way. I mean, there are other ways of framing this. Like, so one way is to say regime want Trump and Harris is a jobber, but another way of saying is that Trump has basically just kind of worn them out, won them over, ground them down, defeated them, won enough elites to his side. He's won basically. Um,
hmm
so that, I mean, the framing on this doesn't necessarily have to be negative, right? Because my book, Populist Illusion, was basically all about people power not being enough. You haven't won power. Like, the problem with Trump in 2016 is that he was the president, but he never had any power. He was in office, but he had no power. He'd give orders, and people would disobey them. Um, and there was always this idea that, you just red pill enough people, and magically things are going to change. And the whole point of the book was like, no, you need to do, you need to be the organized minority. And fair play to some of these people. I mean, I don't know. Some of these people follow me on Twitter as well, of course. I don't know if they read the book or if they, I don't know if through other means they started reading their elite theory independently, but it's obvious that especially the tech bros know this stuff. I mean, I've heard Vivek Ramaswamy even reference it in various different things. So they have, in a way, become the organized minority. Um, but to be clear, I don't think the tech bros were decisive this time. The key group backing Trump, I still think, are the Zionists. And something very interesting has happened on that side too, because it's there's this phrase neocon that goes around. Okay, now, and everybody in Trump world, in MAGA world, is always worried about the neocons sneaking back in. I do think that there is a difference between the Ben Shapiro, for example, and the what you call them OG neocons or the neocons of the Bush era. Because if you notice, all of those went for Kamala Harris. I think there was a list of 200 old neocons who went for Kamala Harris. Dick Cheney and
Yeah, Cheney.
I mean, but basically anyone who's a relic of the W. Bush era is part of that weird Lincoln project. And then they're never Trumpers or they've just become Democrats now. David French, people like this. Okay. There is a difference between those people, those old fashioned neocons, I guess you could say, and what I'm calling the Zionists now. And this was opaque to me until the data was in, if you want. It wasn't clear to me until the events of the past year played out. Um, and where I think the real difference is, Nick, is between Ukraine and Israel, basically, because those old OG neocons had this idea of America being the policeman of the world, of spreading quote unquote democracy. We're going to bomb Iraq into democracy and things like this. Um, and they're very committed to projects like neo imperial projects, you might say, like Ukraine. And they've always had a kind of hate boner for Russia for some reason. Um, and this thinking is also, by the
Maybe it goes
way,
back to the Cold War.
yeah, maybe, but this thinking is also endemic in the British elite as well. The British government is very much part of that way of thinking for some reason. If you notice, the most hawkish voices in the world on Ukraine have been our politicians, our government. Whether it was Boris Johnson or Sunak or even now the Starmer government, they're all 100% in on Ukraine. There's been theories as to why that is. I've heard it said that the Bank of England picked up a lot of the kind of liability for the cost of Ukraine. How they manage that, I don't know. Um, whereas the what I'm calling Zionists, as opposed to the old-fashioned neocons, are they're just much more about supporting Israel in this moment, supporting Benjamin Netanyahu in this moment, right now, in this current thing that they're doing. And of course, in American political terms, if they keep on giving like 80, $100 billion to Ukraine every couple of months, as Joe Biden was doing, or if their focus is on Russia, their focus is not, or their resources are not down on the other conflict. And I really do believe that that is one of the key interesting developments in American politics that we've seen, that divergence between the old fashioned neocons and this new type of Ben Shapiro type of Zionist. Um, and in fact, Ben Shapiro had a debate recently with Sam Harris. I don't know if you watched that, but that
The
showed,
one moderated by Barry Weiss. I didn't
yeah, the
watch it.
what, yeah, well, that basically showed the two positions. Sam Harris, in a way, is almost the establishment position of yesterday. right? The old neocons of the Bush era, they suddenly feel like yesterday's men, don't they? They feel like they're irrelevant now. Victoria Newland and Robert Kagan and all these types of characters, they're just all of a sudden yesterday's men. This is what I'm trying to stress though is that when I'm saying Zionist, I do not mean that old neocon set because they're still probably the most vocally anti-Trump people in the world. Um, the old-fashioned neocons, they hate him for because they know he's going to stop the Ukraine war, and they're all in on the Ukraine war for reasons which may become apparent in the future, or probably will never become apparent to most of us, um, as to why. I mean, I don't know if you noticed, Nick, but Europe is very invested in Ukraine, right? The EU,
Hmm.
the globalist side of the equation, they're all in on Ukraine. Trump is not, and that's one of the
Yeah,
reasons I think that you still get those voices who hate him so much. It's because of that.
yeah. You're right. I mean, it's great for people who love Israel, Trump coming in, and bad for people who want the Ukraine war to continue. There's no doubt. And yeah, Ben Shapiro is a great example because he was so never Trump. Then he had him on his show eventually and even funded his campaign, donated. And you could tell he pretty much said, in fact, that he still doesn't like him personally, but he had him on his show and interviewed him reluctantly. And then even on the election night, he even went as far as saying, yep, he's everything he said he is. He's the greatest man of his time. He's a sort of world historical figure. Yeah, I was wrong, sort of thing. And whether he's saying that because Trump is just so awesome that he's proved it, which is actually true, or whether Shapiro is just saying it because he's pro Israel now. He's just so he's happy to play the game. It doesn't really matter. But on the Ukraine thing, is that where people's real fear of Trump is? Because I was watching Bonnie Greer of all people on Question Time. A clip just came up. She was talking about how dangerous Trump is, and the reasons were really that he's tearing up the post-war rule book. Because if you look at Trump domestically, it seems to me quite benign in a way. Whether we like it perfectly or not is one question, but it's liberalism, it's prosperity, it's freedom, it's like high skilled immigration, it's tech bros, as you say. It's all fairly hard to hate unless you're an insane sort of lefty. You can criticize it from the right as well, but it's fairly hard to be like that's dangerous and evil. But abroad, I think is where they're really scared because Trump uh, in the globalist sphere is where he just doesn't seem to play ball. He's like, what's the point of the UN, by the way? What's the point of NATO? Ukraine? Why are we in Ukraine? And he just what's the EU? Because he asked these sort of fundamental, sort of disruptive questions. He was known as a disruptor in 2016. Is that
Mhm.
really where their fear of Trump is, as a sort of on the international stage more than the domestic?
Yeah, I've been convinced for a long time that it's the foreign policy piece that they really care about, and this is why they've hated Trump for as long as they have. Um, I mean, it's interesting to note that most of the European populist movements, including Farage here, are also broadly aligned with Israel. If you noticed, Geert Wilders in Netherlands, Le Pen in France, uh, Salvini, and to some extent Maloney, to a lesser extent Maloney in Italy, um, less the AFD. I've got less of a read on the AFD, but broadly speaking, I mean, Viktor Orban is as well. Um, they're all broadly aligned with the kind of harder core Zionists, right? Which the left wing media call far right. You know, in the left wing media, Netanyahu is quote unquote far right, right? That's how they talk about him. But so it's been interesting to me that you have this alignment. You have this alignment between Israeli nationalism and a kind of nationalism, or at least a populism rising in Europe as well as in America, and that association goes back quite a long way now. Um, and it could, I mean, it in a way it makes sense if you split it. If you see the real opponents of uh, that kind of Zionist view of the world as being the techno globalists, right? Now, what makes this a little bit confusing is that most of those globalists are kind of small z Zionist, right? I.e., they support the existence of Israel, right? They want Israel to exist. Um, Where the difference is they want a global governance architecture, right? They want, I mean, and I think that they were at the peak of their powers in recent times during COVID. I think there was a massive globalist power grab during COVID, where all of a sudden, everybody was talking about the WEF and Klaus Schwab, and we all had to, they were locking us down, and we all had to take the vaccines, and and everybody was talking about the globalists then. And it seems to me that in more recent times, they're on the back foot, and there's been a different ascendant power, which is much more about American power per se, and also about the specific project of protecting Israel there. Um, Now, I think the idea, or the kind of tacit agreement between uh, the reason that, let's say, Netanyahu backs these populist um, movements everywhere, or the reason that the populists support Israel, is because there's a logic to it, right? It's not a million mile, it's not a long step to saying, oh, right, so they are having to do what they need to do there, and kind of we need to start doing similar things here, right? Because you're protecting your borders, you're protecting. I mean, it's kind of a more nationalist program. So there is a kind of logic to it, um, but whether that comes to fruition or not remains to be seen. And in the case of Trump, I think the two parts of this coalition that we've been talking about, the Ben Shapiro side and the base tech bro side, they're allied at the moment, right? Trump hasn't even come into office yet, but I can see many scenarios where they might fall out. Um, Really simple scenario. I remember once Netanyahu annoyed Trump before because he congratulated Biden. Do you remember? In the middle of
Hmm.
all the drama in 2020, Trump remembered that, and it's in the back. Whether he's forgotten it now, I don't know. But that just shows there's potential for Trump to get upset with him. And the scenario between America and Israel in the past 4 years has been Joe Biden sets red lines or says, you're not going to do this. And Netanyahu
Yeah.
says, yeah,
Then
I'm
they
going to do
ignore
it.
him.
I'm going to do it anyway. What are you going to do? Basically, I'm going to defy you. Now, you can do that to Joe Biden because he's basically an old man, a blank. He's barely there, wasn't really the president. Can you do that with a man like Donald Trump? And if he does Trump just take it, or does he say, or does his ego kick in and say, "Listen, cross me once, I've come in for you again. I've done more for this country than anyone. You're going to do it to me again." The other thing I think about is that this time around, it's not just Trump who's a volatile personality. Elon Musk is a volatile personality. RFK Jr. is a bit of a loose cannon. So you've got these other characters who are around, also with big, strong personalities, and it's like, okay, they've come in on this alliance, but can you really not see a situation where one pisses off the other, or vice versa? And if that
Yeah.
happens, things could get really interesting during the Trump presidency as to which one of those two factions kind of becomes truly ascendant. And there's already been the smatterings of it, because in that talk that Shapiro did with Sam Harris, he was kind of boasting a little bit, saying, "Oh, I know who's going to be in Trump's cabinet. Mike Pompeo, for example." Well, I don't know if you've seen any of the chatter online, Nick, but the MAGA base hate Mike Pompeo with an absolute passion, and the base is just saying, "No, he's a criminal. Don't put him in." Okay. And in times gone past, what used to happen is that the base would speak, somebody like Tucker Carlson would funnel that back to Trump, and Trump would be like, "Yeah, we're not going to do it." So it's going to be really interesting. That's one of the names I'm looking for, and everybody's looking for. Is Mike Pompeo going to be in that cabinet? Because another figure close to the Trump camp, Robert Barnes. I don't know if you're aware of him.
I am,
The
yeah,
kind of
because Barnes said Pompeo won't come back, but Shapiro said he
ex-
will come back. That was the key difference.
exactly, and you see, there's that split I'm talking about in embryo, really, between. I mean, there is actually a third faction in the MAGA coalition that we haven't talked about because they have no real elite representation, and that is basically just the base. The base are not tech bros, libertarians. I'll tell you that. And the base are also not
No.
particularly hardcore. Like, I mean, some of the evangelicals might be, but most of Trump's base don't really care about some conflict going on thousands of miles away. They care about their jobs and their immigration and all of the domestic issues. And that's going to be another interesting part because in a weird way, the MAGA base has it does find a voice in people like Tucker Carlson. I actually even wonder if Vance may act as a conduit like Tucker has done before, feeding back what the we talked about regime mood music, right? There's also like MAGA mood. There's kind of like bass mood music, and I mean, one of the times I remember when Trump was actually the president. Do you remember that time where he just started bombing Syria? And all of the media came out and
Mm.
said, "Oh, Trump has never been so presidential. Now he's bombing Syria. We absolutely love him all of a sudden." And then Tucker Carlson went on Fox and cut a promo on Trump saying, "What you doing, Donald?" And it just stopped the next day. Do you remember that? Because I remember it. And that happened quite a number of times where Tucker would intervene and Trump would change. So these are some
Mm.
things that we're going to be looking forward to in the forthcoming months and years, because just because these are the factions that have been behind him doesn't mean that they're all going to get all of their own way. We'll see. Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting. You're right. I mean, Trump, my prediction is yes, he's pro Israel, but he's pro Trump and he wants to keep his brand, which is now anti war. Trump doesn't go to war. There are no wars with Trump. So if Netanyahu gets too carried away, he will say no. Yeah, and he's also like, don't defy American power. So I totally agree. Netanyahu has to be very careful, or he could lose that. And Trump likes to take out ISIS and do these targeted things and Abu, he died like a dog, all that stuff. But he doesn't like to do big neocon wars. So yeah, I think that's going to be really interesting. And yeah, I tell you what, we've done almost an hour, so let's say goodbye on YouTube. And go. And I'm going to do an extra bit if Nima's got time on my site nickdixon.net. But just for YouTube, Nima, where can people find you?
I'm an academic agent on YouTube. I have a site where I sell courses called the Academic Agency, which you can just Google it, you'll find it. And on Twitter, I am OG Roland Rat.
Yes, famously. All right. Well, not everyone actually realizes that, but yeah. Okay. So, and obviously, I'm Nick Dixon Comic on Twitter. But the key thing is subscribe to my YouTube. But if you want the extra stuff, go to nickdixon.net. It's only £5, and which is the price of what, half a pint in London. Depends where you live. Nickdixon.net, and you'll get all the extra stuff, full episodes with great guests like Dr. Nima Parvini. But for now, we'll see you later, YouTube, and go over to nickdixon.net.